When the devil went down to Georgia looking for a soul to steal, he also couldn't find Chris Tompkins. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Christopher Carlton Thompkins was born on December 28, 1981, to Anne Mackenzie of Columbus, Georgia. And outside of that, there is essentially no other information about Christopher Tompkins to be found on the internet. I looked, could not figure out what high school he went to, could only really figure out that he, in fact, did live in Columbus from the period of the late 90s to the time he went missing. But that was it. There's not a ton else there. And Columbus, it's a decent-sized city, so there's 4 high schools. I couldn't even find a yearbook for the proper year. This was not going to be an easy one to dig up information on. But the good news is I was able to get information about the area in which Chris lived. Columbus itself is a mid-sized city of about 200,000 people, which sits on the banks of Lake Oliver. It's the start of the navigable portion, or at least it was the beginning of the navigable portion of the Chattahoochee River when the city itself was founded. And it sits on the border, of course the border being the river, between Alabama and Georgia. It is also home to a Civil War museum, which I'm going to take a wild guess is probably not the most accurate place on Earth given its location. And speaking of war, I need to talk to you about today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid Shadow Legends is a turn-based tactical RPG hero collector game played by over 80 million people worldwide, and most importantly, it is completely free to play. Raid is unique because the console-quality graphics on a mobile platform bring to life over 650 champions. With that many different heroes to choose from, there are billions of ways that you can customize them in order to defeat tons of different bosses. And of course, what do you do after defeating a boss? You celebrate with a dinner party. For that purpose, we decided to pick some guests, and my hope is that they can help me prevent any more Bigfoot-related injuries. Our buddy Cardiel starts off the batch, just in case we need some security. The guy kills it in the arena and makes us all better with significant critical rate and damage buffs. And of course, if anyone has an incident, we're gonna need Raglan there to do some revives. With just a 2-turn cooldown, she's the quickest revive character in the game. And of course, no party is complete without a dwarf, which is why I selected Gala Longbraids. Her attacks ignore 50% of a target's defense, while turning some of that energy into a powerful shield. Finally, every party needs a good roast master, which is why Angar gets my final invite. He's the king of insults and sure to get everyone good and provoked. Of course, it's better when it's against waves of enemies in PvE play, but there's also big news for Raid Shadow Legends players because they're bringing in the live PvP arena, where you can show down against other players to earn all sorts of cool prizes. That includes new artifact sets, fragments for a legendary Void champion, and special live arena crests which unlock powerful bonuses in the Great Hall. With all this exciting stuff coming to Raid, if you haven't started playing yet, what exactly are you waiting for? Use the link in my description or scan the QR code on screen to get access to some insane bonuses. We're talking epic champion Kellen the Strike, as well as XP brews, energy refills, and magic potions. Once you're in and crushing enemies, come find me under the name The Aiden Mattis, and if you're quick enough, you can even join my clan. Just click the link in my description and I'll see you on the battlefield. But anyway, back to Chris Tompkins and the no good, very bad, terrible hike. Prior to settlement by Europeans, the area was home to the Muskogee Creek peoples. The Muskogee were known as one of the 5 civilized tribes by the Anglo-American settlers. Of course, this did not really protect them from anti-native sentiment when that came to pass. And they were referred to as the 5 civilized tribes, not because they were, like the Mayans or the Aztecs and had their own discernible civilization, which they did. It was more because they adopted Anglo-Saxon culture. It's kind of a backhanded compliment. Like many others, most of the Muskogee were actually forced west of the Mississippi during Andrew Jackson's Trail of Tears. Like many other native tribes in the region, they were subject to the Indian Removal Act and they were forced west of the Mississippi. But prior to the Trail of Tears, the Muskogee operated as a confederacy of Muskogean language-speaking tribal groups. And though their ancient history is not well known, it's believed that they are descendants of the Mississippian mound-building cultures that built places like Cahokia. Those mounds themselves are pretty impressive structures if you see them in person. They're quite large given the construction technique, which was literally just carrying soil over, tamping it down with your feet, and then carrying more soil and putting it on top. Initially, it's believed that these were for graves, but later on they became the sites of temples and places for the chief to live on a higher platform than everybody else. The shapes of these mounds also would vary between flat-top pyramids and sort of rounded, almost mesa-like structures. And if you look at them, they're not entirely dissimilar in construction technique from the Celtic hill forts you would see over in Europe, though they didn't serve quite the same defensive purpose. The Muskogee Muskogee were also part of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, which refers to the rituals, artifacts, ideology, and mythology of the Mississippian cultural group. The belief system, rituals, and associated artifacts are believed to have developed around 100 to 500 AD and range from the Midwest all the way down to Florida. The Muskogee have also been the subject of a rather interesting bit of pseudo-history, pseudoscience, hullabaloo. It's not quite to the level of Graham Hancock, but a guy by the name of Richard L. Thornton believes that he has discovered the ancient roots of the Muskogee peoples, that they were not actually part of the Mississippi culture, but that they were transplants from the Maya. Thornton also makes the argument that they had a set of beliefs that were extraordinarily similar to Christianity. For example, their own flood myth, their own single creator being, their own immortal afterlife. Of course, the problem with Thornton's arguments is that he doesn't seem to base them on anything. I haven't had a chance to read his book yet, but reading through the articles he's written, he kind of just says this stuff and then doesn't back it up. But then the problem with the criticism is that none of it actually disproves what he says. It's just, he doesn't have a degree in the right thing, or his writing style is informal, or he's self-published, or, those kinds of things, where they're not actually attacking the subject of the work, they are attacking his character. And that leads me to believe that maybe he is sort of onto something, or that they don't know enough to actually disprove what he's saying. Anyway, I bring this up not to say that the Muskogee were practicing Christianity, but rather to say that if you're gonna argue that somebody's wrong about something from an academic perspective, you should probably explain why instead of simply saying they're incorrect. However, I was able to find an American Bureau of Ethnology report from 1939 on the beliefs of the Muskogee, and they were pretty interesting. The Muskogee believed in something called Hisakita, or the breath, which was essentially the will of the creator spirit. They also believed that everybody had two souls, although this may have been a bit of a language barrier issue, and two souls doesn't quite match what they describe, but I won't get too deeply into that. One of those souls is a guardian spirit that appears at the age of puberty. It was called Inutska, and it was sort of a, spiritual guiding force. This, of course, was counterbalanced by Yafaketa, which was a spirit, a soul that ruled over passion and sentiment and worldly things. But that's about all I could find on their actual religion, and most of it has, of course, disappeared as Europeans colonized the area. And of course, that colonization effort led to the city of Columbus being built, a whole bunch of people moving there, doing jobs, expanding, and it was expanding that Chris was working on when all of the unfortunate events of the day he went missing happened. Nearby to Columbus is an unincorporated community called Ellerslie, and for those who don't know, an unincorporated community means that it has no municipal local government of its own. It's not directly incorporated into any larger government, it just kind of operates, and these are usually places that are below 1,000 people. The village first appeared on the US Census in 2020, where it was listed as having 1,053 people, of whom 80% were white, 10% were African American, and the remaining 10% were a smattering of other mixed ethnic backgrounds. I mentioned the racial demographics because, unlike most missing 411 cases, the subject in this one is black. And while that's not necessarily a factor, there's no proof that that had anything to do with his disappearance, it might have played into the events of January 25th, 2002. At approximately 8:10 a.m. that day, Chris kissed his mother on the cheek and headed off to work. The 5'7", 130-pound young man was part of a 4-man survey crew led by Gary White, which was headed up to Ellerslie to check out some land between Warm Springs Road and Georgia Route 85. Chris drove himself to the actual office and then hitched a ride to the location with his boss. And this case is weird for a few other reasons. A lot of what we talk about is people who go missing in very large, uninhabited areas, namely national parks. But in this case, we're talking about a spot that is wilderness, yes, but it's at most 4 miles long and only 2,000 feet wide. It's just between 2 state roads. So while of course there's still wilderness around, this is an area that is not totally uninhabited. There's roads, houses, businesses surrounding the area they were working. It's hard to know precisely what the area they were in looked like in 2002, but if it's anything like today, then it would be pretty heavily wooded with creeks crisscrossing it and a few little marshy areas. And one of the problems with this story is that almost nothing is available about the actual events of that day, and all of it comes from Chris's coworkers. According to them, shortly after lunch, between 1 and 1:30 p.m., they were all walking in a line about 50 feet apart from one another. Now, it's unclear whether that was a horizontal line or a vertical line. going straight, a column or a row. But either way, there was someone just 50 feet from Chris. I've requested the police reports and the actual interviews and witness statements, but because this is still an open missing persons case, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation wasn't able to share any of that information with me. According to news reports, however, an unnamed coworker was the one who was closest to Chris. He looked away from him for just a moment as they were walking all together, and when he looked back, Chris was not there anymore. He was just gone, vanished, without a sound, without a trace. When police did ask his coworkers if anything was out of the ordinary, they told them that Chris had been acting a little bit strange for the last several days, and that was about it. That didn't go into any detail about how strange it was, what kind of strange we're talking here. Maybe they did give police specific examples, but none of them were reported by the media. As far as they were concerned, there was nothing particularly odd about this. They thought Chris had just kind of been in a weird mood and decided to walk off the job that day. Shortly after he walked off the job, Gary White, the lead surveyor on the crew, the owner of the company, I believe, called his wife to tell her that Chris was missing. This was around 1:30 p.m. There are no details of what was said on that call, aside from that she was informed Chris was missing, so I don't know if she was instructed to tell Chris's mom or go to the police or anything like that. Either way, nobody informed Chris's mom, Ann Mackenzie, until 4:15 p.m. Now, unfortunately, according to Georgia law, back then at least, you had to wait 24 hours to report an adult missing. But not willing to wait, Chris's family actually just went out looking for him themselves. And this is where things start to get a little interesting. Chris's coworkers had said that they spent a few hours looking for Chris, trying to find him, and nothing came up, not a single trace of the man. Chris's family, however, who didn't start off knowing Chris's exact location when he disappeared, combed the area for several hours, and they found one of his boots, about 12 cents in change laying on the ground, and a piece of blue fiber that was stuck in a barbed wire fence. When Chris had left that morning, he'd been wearing a black shirt, a blue-gray plaid jacket, navy blue Dickies, it was 2002, tan FUBU work boots, a black skull cap, and a black watch. His mother believed that the blue fiber must have come from his pants, and that whenever he ran off or walked off, or perhaps was carried off, his work tools, 12 cents and change, a few other things dropped onto the ground, and that was it. Because their findings did not match the story that his coworkers told, that he must have just walked off of his own accord, they believed that he was in fact taken against his will. And at this point, I do need to mention that a number of sources will tell you that Chris's coworkers, or the police, or some sort of investigative body found Chris's belongings. No, that was his family. In fact, as far as a police investigation goes, all the information I can find is that they brought in bloodhounds and the bloodhounds couldn't find anything. And with what limited info I can find, it appears there was no sign of a struggle, no indication that Chris had been involved in any sort of altercation, and nobody mentioned any kind of fighting or arguing. Furthermore, Miss Mackenzie claimed that Chris had been acting completely normally, that she was with him every day, he lived with her after all, and she had noticed nothing out of the ordinary with her son's behavior, so she didn't believe that he actually had been acting strangely, as Gary White, his boss, had said. And she also worked for Gary White's family as a babysitter. She also noted that Chris, were he of sound mind, would not have taken off his boots even if he were walking off the job. It was January, it was 55 degrees out, this was not a nice warm day. You weren't going to walk off without your boots, and also, why would you take off your boots? It's not where he was at the point where it was cold enough for paradoxical undressing, and taking off your work boots to walk through underbrush doesn't make any sense at all. Chris would have had to have been in a very strange state of mind, and I feel like they probably would have noticed that. They said he had been acting strangely, but that's more than acting strangely. That is a different person. That is a person going through psychosis or a crisis. As far as that aspect of the story goes, it really comes down to who do you believe more, his coworkers or his mom. Another issue with that side of the story, that he just walked off of his own accord, to start a new life somewhere or something, is that he never went back for his car and his keys were never found. And then, months later, several miles away, on someone else's property, they found his other boot. So are we to believe that Chris took off one boot at the site, climbed through a barbed wire fence, walked several miles with only one shoe, then took off the other boot and continued walking? That's basically what the police said is they thought happened, is that, you know what, he just willingly went missing. He vanished of his own accord. Now, if he actually did vanish of his own accord, that does rule this out as a missing 411 case by David Paulides' own standards, so it's safe to say that David does not believe that he went missing of his own volition. And that's what everyone believed. On September 20th, 2002, a group of about 50 protesters, most of them African American, gathered in front of the Harris County Sheriff's Office. In this case, they weren't so much protesting what the police were doing, so much as what they weren't doing. They saw the failure to locate Chris and the fact that it was written off as a voluntary disappearance as a lack of effort by the police department and possibly a racially motivated one. Speaking to the newspaper, Sheriff Mike Jolie said that they had actually done above and beyond. They had gone the extra mile. This was more investigation than they usually do, which, to be perfectly honest, if this qualifies as extra investigation, they need to bump it up. Like, this is pathetic compared to what we saw from the Park and Sweetgrass County Sheriff's Departments or the Warren County Sheriff's Department in the case of Aaron Hedges and Tom Messick. Racially motivated or not, this was a total failure by the investigators. And they seemed to know that they were not equipped to handle this kind of investigation because they ended up handing the case off to state-level authorities, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. And when I spoke to a representative from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, a woman who had actually worked on this specific case, she was unfortunately not able to give me any comments or information beyond what was publicly available due to its status as an open case. During an interview, when the protest was occurring, the sheriff tried to kind of absolve himself and partially shift the blame onto Chris himself by saying that Chris's mother had admitted that Chris was using drugs the week prior, but it doesn't specify what kind of drugs, and if Chris smoked a joint with his buddies, a week before he went missing, that's not exactly going to cause him to go missing. It's just a very lazy way to avoid culpability. Despite police efforts to convince everyone that Chris had taken off one shoe, emptied his pockets, climbed over a barbed wire fence, walked several miles through woods and marsh, and then taken off his other shoe and just disappeared, his family wasn't really buying it. His family continued to search for clues and look for a way to explain Chris's disappearance, and in 2008, his mother spoke to the Columbus Ledger-Inquirer, basically just trying to rejuvenate interest in the case. She held no illusions about whether or not Chris was dead or alive. She fully believed that he had passed away at some point, but she didn't want him to just disappear. She didn't want the case to go unsolved. Then in 2009, partial skeletal remains were found off of I-185 in Harris County, Georgia. Investigators located a skull fragment, leg bones, and pelvic bones, and said that when they were found on Memorial Day 2009, they had been there for at least a year. There were 3 people they believed that these were likely to belong to, and one of those people was Chris. Unfortunately, according to a 2012 news report, the remains did not match any of the 3 people they thought they would be. The case came up again in 2015 when Columbus community activists presented it as an example of delayed justice, claiming that the sheriff's department, the investigators, the police, simply had not done enough to help Chris's family or Chris himself, and they believed that it might be due to the fact that he was African American. Antonio Carter pointed out to the press the ridiculousness of the police story regarding how Chris went missing, that it didn't make any sense that he did what his coworkers claimed he did. Instead, Antonio believed that Chris was probably taken by somebody else. The next year, 2016, Chris's family held a vigil, as they do often, to remember their missing family member. Speaking to the press, they expressed disbelief at the official narrative, the official story, saying that there was no sign that Chris would do something like that. He was a happy, kind, gentle young man. He had just become a born-again Christian. He was, having a good life. He was a happy guy. Put simply, they said he would just never do that. He would never walk off like this without telling anybody. He wouldn't do that to his mother. He wouldn't do that to his family. And, again, the boots were in separate places. Finally, in June 2018, the Harris County Sheriff's Department put out another request for information about Chris's disappearance. They asked that anybody with knowledge of what happened come forward, but it appears, since there's been no movement on the case in the last 5 years, that nobody did come forward with anything. It seems likely that the only people who could possibly know what actually happened to Chris were those 3 coworkers that were with him that day. Due to the lack of clues, as well as the completely shoddy official explanation for what happened, a large number of theories have abounded about this subject, about this specific case. Everything from what we talked about, one of our early videos on this, back when we hadn't looked into as much of the detail behind it, that something like a Wendigo or Bigfoot came and grabbed him, as far to the, more normal belief that maybe Chris was murdered by his coworkers. But why would Chris be murdered by his coworkers? And why does the added detail of this story make it far less supernatural sounding? Well, initially, the story is that Chris's coworkers didn't see him go missing. They did not know what happened. They, were all just on the trail, and then Chris wasn't there. In the version of the story that I first heard, which I believe is the one written out by Politis in Missing 411, it was Chris's coworkers who found his belongings, and they were confused about everything. But with the added context that Chris's coworkers didn't find the belongings, they didn't know they were there, allegedly, and it was his family that found them, suddenly it starts to seem less mysterious. It starts to seem like less of a supernatural occurrence, less of a, alien abduction, and more like maybe he got into an argument, maybe his buddies decided to rob him. There's any number of possibilities here. It is a little bit odd that 3 people managed to maintain their stories well enough for 20 years that nobody has suspected them, but that is a small enough group of people to keep something secret. Others have said that maybe Chris experienced some sort of psychotic episode. Maybe he started having trouble differentiating, his imagination from reality, thought something was chasing him, or, thought that he was in a place that he wasn't. There's a number of possibilities, but that doesn't explain why he took off the shoes or how he climbed through a barbed wire fence without cutting himself. If he was going through an episode of some sort, he would likely not be in the mental position, especially if he thought he needed to run from something, to carefully enough climb through a barbed wire fence to not hurt himself, yet still snag some fibers from his pants. Alternatively, had he entered a fugue state, it would explain him simply just walking off, but it doesn't explain how he managed to do it quickly enough that his coworkers, searching the area immediately as they said they did, wouldn't have been able to catch him or find him. There's also the fact that Chris's remains were never found. Now, how did he manage to survive walking half barefoot several miles through marshes, undergrowth, bushes, trees, creeks, across streams, probably crossing roads, with nobody seeing him and him not getting hurt, so that he could take off another boot several miles away and be fine? It's pretty certain that he didn't sit there in his right mind saying, I'm just gonna walk away from this. But it also seems very unlikely that something supernatural happened, something like a Thunderbird coming down and snagging him, or a UFO picking him up and spiriting him away. Especially given the fact that his boots were found. If something had taken him, why would it take off his boots? The angle that seems to make the most sense in this story is rather that his coworkers were involved, and that the whole narrative that Chris just vanished after lunch wasn't true. Maybe they were roughhousing with him, maybe he ate something and got sick. There are any number of possibilities here. Maybe they just decided they didn't like him. Maybe he was being a jerk. Who knows? But it seems like the story they told can't be right. But then it would also be pretty sloppy of them if they did kidnap or kill Chris to leave his boots there. Unless they were doing it on purpose to create some sort of diversion, some kind of red herring, to make the police go, all right, well, he clearly climbed through this fence because his pants got snagged on it, so we should go looking for him out here. Maybe, in fact, the 3 hours between Chris disappearing and somebody being informed that Chris had in fact disappeared were them taking the time to hide that body somewhere. Of course, I have no hard evidence of this, so I'm not going to sit here and accuse somebody of doing that, but it does seem like maybe foul play is the most likely explanation for this one, if not one with a ton of evidence. But as always, we'd love to hear what your guys' thoughts are on it, so let us know in the comments if you agree that it was foul play, or if you think it was supernatural, let us know why. And if you want to catch these discussions live, you can check that out on our podcast, which is usually at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Sunday nights. You can also subscribe to our Patreon for just $1 a month. That really helps support the show. If you'd like to taste the Lore Lodge, you can get our specialty coffee from Tableau Roasting Company in Mount Pocono Park. And if you want to look great while also repping Lore Lodge, you can get some merch at thelorelodge.shop. We have all sorts of stuff saying wonderful things like, this is my Wendussy hunting cap, or pity for the gourd. You know how it goes. But with that said, I'm Aiden Mattis. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.